The Education of OverSoul7 by Jane Roberts, read by Martin John. Chapter 4, The Descent of Proteus. Proteus had been aware of his emotional pull toward the earth for as long as he could remember. It was shared by practically no one. None of his school friends showed the slightest interest. During the long afternoons, when they sat at their separate living areas for television classes, and when they chatted back and forth via video during discussion periods, Earth was hardly ever mentioned. They did not talk about going outside when school was over and the sets turned off, but none of them seemed to realize that outside wasn't really outside. Of course, the plastic trees were replicas of real ones, and the shade they provided was real enough. But the steadily illuminated inner sky beneath the dome was never that bright. Shade wasn't needed that badly. It was just for effect. No birds flew through the branches either, and no matter how well cared for the trees were, they always looked artificial to him. It seemed sometimes as if he knew better, that in some forgotten past he'd known real trees and would never be satisfied with fake ones. Which was impossible, of course. The floating cities were held in place by automatically powered motors that automatically compensated for any drift relative to particular designated points on Earth. No one alive remembered the time when people lived on Earth in any numbers, and there had never been real trees in the Dome City complexes. But despite this, he dreamed frequently of Earth as it used to be. He felt angry on its behalf. They'd simply abandoned it, given it up. He began devouring the microfilms that were available from the vast video library. Often he sat up late at night, secretly, watching the films until morning. His excitement grew with his knowledge. There were various outposts on Earth, archaeological sites and diggings, several scientific installations, and, he suspected, a few back-to-nature communities that somehow eluded satellite surveillance. He couldn't be sure of this, he told himself for the 100th time, but it was a possibility. He began to gather supplies weeks in advance of his plan. His mother had an administrative position, coming home only a few weekends in a 6-month period. So hiding his intent from her was no problem. Maintaining secrecy in the face of his father's almost constant presence was something else again. Matthias was a group father, though, keeping track of some 30 boys and girls on closed-circuit television, overseeing their studies and scheduled activities. Seeing his father so engaged always made Proteus angry. Why couldn't classes be held in one big school nodule, as they had in ages past? This afternoon, though, every thought but one fled from Proteus's concern. Each Tuesday, he and his friend, Grek, went hiking, an activity favored by almost everyone, to ensure sufficient muscular and motor development. This Tuesday would be different, though, from any other. Proteus thought that Grek would sense his excitement the minute they met, no matter how he tried to hide it. But Grek just walked beside him, talking as usual about everyday events. Everything Proteus did or said himself seemed unnatural and suspicious to him. He kept throwing sideways glances at Grek, sure that he'd somehow given himself away, But Grek obviously saw nothing different about the day or about Proteus. They'd taken their lunch as usual. Out of sheer nervousness, Proteus suggested that they see which of the two of them could eat the quickest. So they went down the plastic streets, whooping and laughing, popping the lunch pills, LPs, in their mouths as fast as possible. They each had 2 protein basics, PBs, 2 carbohydrate simples, CSs, and an amino acid supplement, AAS. Proteus let Grek win because he felt guilty about hiding his plans from him, and he was feeling guiltier each minute. The game had been foolish, too, he thought. It would be the last time he'd gobble his LPs so nonchalantly, so sure of his constant supply. Had he stashed away enough of them? He was sure that he had. Still. "You sure are quiet," Grek said. "Oh, it's the same old thing," Proteus said. "Walking down these streets depress me, though. I know it shouldn't. And I keep wishing boys were given the same training that girls are, taken into the heart of business and politics at a young age, so they can see how the world works. If we were girls, we'd be studying seriously at our age, not just passively watching our fathers manage the living nodules or learning important mundane skills." Actually, Proteus was surprised at the normal sound of his dissatisfaction in his voice, because he was only talking for something to say. But he wasn't concerned with problems like that anymore. Not him. A few boys went by on aero skis. A man sat on the porch of a nodule, his face expressionless as they passed. "See," Proteus said, "he looks as artificial as the trees." "Well, not really. My father knows him. He's got as much responsibility as any man around here. But it just isn't enough. He manages rain regulation, but it's all computerized anyway." "Oh, don't start on that stuff again," Grek said. "My father says you'll end up in real trouble. You're so damn dissatisfied all the time." This sent Proteus into a laughing fit. "If you only knew," he said. "I mean, how funny that is. What kind of trouble can you get into around here?" "I don't know," Grek said uneasily. "That's it. None," Proteus went on. His talk was supposed to keep Grek occupied while he went over his own last-minute plans. As the time approached for him to make his move, he was getting more and more nervous. Soon Grek would suggest that they return. As usual, they'd be expected home before supper, and they'd been walking about 2 hours. It was near 6 p.m. Would he miss his father? Grek? Wasn't there something he could say to Grek without giving the whole thing away? Something that Grek could remember afterward? "Grek, we're friends, aren't we? Look, I like you a lot." Grek stopped and stared at him. "What did you need to say that for?" "Sure we're friends." "I don't know." Proteus felt like laughing, like crying. He felt secretive, yet like shouting his secret aloud where everyone could hear it. He caught himself. He needed the 2-hour head start. He had to get to the ramp that he'd staked out. He said nonchalantly, "Let's go back a different way." He paused and looked around as if trying to make up his mind which way to take. Actually, he was taking a long last look at the neighborhood in which he'd lived as long as he remembered. The living nodules stretched as far as he could see. Each complex was a duplication of ancient Earth conditions, as perfect as art and science could make it. Each city was done in the decor of a particular Earth period. This one was 19th century America. He lived in the Ohio block. "We always go home the way we came," Greg said. "I know, but the lunch race gave me an idea. Let's each take a different route to my nodule and see who gets there first. I'll go a block to the left and you go a block to the right. It's just an idea. If you don't want to," Proteus broke off. He knew Greg would agree. Any kind of challenge was always fun. "All right, ready, set, go!" Greg shouted. He turned around without looking back, and began to run as fast as he could to the right. Shocked, Proteus just stood there for a moment. He hadn't realized that Greg would take off so quickly, or that there wouldn't be time to make some gesture, some veiled goodbye. Greg disappeared around the corner. Proteus began to run himself, going faster and faster now, stopping only when he had to catch his breath. The lightning springing material of the sidewalk just gave a trifle with each step, so that he felt an added sense of acceleration, as if he were running so quickly that he could just take off above the treetops. His feet were strangely cold, although the air was maintained at a constant 73.2, and his heart was pounding when he finally came out onto the 5-acre area of artificial trees and fields that surrounded the city complex. Benches were neatly placed around the landscape, each with one bush beside it, and a pot full of simulated flowers. Now at supper time the area was vacant. Some of the flowers were growing brittle. Scientists were working on a new material that might actually reproduce itself, or at least repair itself, maintaining a more natural look. Proteus wondered if he'd ever come back, and if he did, whether or not the new plastic life would replace the old. A week ago, he'd carefully cut out a whole chunk of grass and placed his survival kit and supplies beneath it. Now he retrieved them hurriedly. It would be dark at 7, when the daylights automatically lowered to minimum illumination. A panicky feeling flickered behind his forehead. Ignoring it, he inflated his aero skis, put his survival kit over his back, and glided through the quiet air. The skis worked by reacting against the air beneath them. His were a boy's set, allowing only an elevation of 6 feet, but they could go fast enough. He was too much in a rush now to enjoy sky skiing as he usually did, but his love of the sport paid off. He was an expert at riding the soft eddies of regulated air that rose and fell, and the skis could go almost 30 miles an hour. The light began to dim to early twilight. It would last for 45 minutes. He wasn't nearly as obvious as he would have been in maximum daylight, and if anyone saw him, he'd just look like any boy sky skiing, if you didn't happen to notice his direction, because now he was heading away from the complex. In another half hour he was at his destination. He floated down, deflated the skis, and tied them around his waist just as the inner sky turned to night light. The ramp entrance had taken him months to discover. Now it was only 10 minutes away. No one came to this area except maintenance crews. Here, no effort had been made to decorate. A series of gray, sprawling plastoid buildings stood silently. He reached the ramp entrance. None of them were guarded. No one but the women crews used them to begin with. Proteus stood, uncertain. Soon Grek would wonder what had happened to him. His father would be worried. Should he go back while he could? Was he doing the right thing? His eyes stung. Boys rarely even competed in the examination for historical training, since it was a woman's field. His father said they rewrote history, but he tried and flunked. If they'd taken him, he probably never would have decided to strike out on his own, to discover Earth on his own. He would have been content with records. Remembering, his resolve came back with a warm rush. The grating was beneath him. He pulled it up easily. It was made for women's lighter hands, and closed it from inside. Quietly, he began to descend the dimly lighted ladder-like stairs. His steps echoed through the aluminum tunnel. His scalp prickled and his ears rang. Suppose, just suppose, that he couldn't get out at the lower end, and someone lock the upper entrance. "You're just acting like a scared kid," he told himself scornfully. He knew that the ramps only extended a few hundred feet, yet it seemed that the steps would never end. There were other ramps, but many were used to transport scientific supplies, and he didn't know their schedules. That's why he'd chosen a utility ramp, because they were visited only several times a year for inspection purposes. But now it occurred to him that if anything happened and he couldn't get out, it would be a long time until he was found. Not that he didn't have enough supplies, he told himself quickly, because he did. He was just nervous because he couldn't have known ahead of time how he'd feel. The descent was oddly distasteful. He felt like one of the archaic-looking insects he'd seen in microfilms, creeping inside the huge ramp that descended from the underside of the city. Maybe it was just the knowledge that each step took him nearer the ramp's end that bothered him, he thought. Twice he stopped to rest, gripping the thin railing with both hands and slipping his survival pack down on the stairs. At the same time, he kept thinking of his father, who must know of his disappearance by now. He was probably questioning Grek at this very moment. To show himself that he didn't really care, he started to run down the stairs, the echo of his steps growing even louder. Then the steps ended. A small door read, "Outlets Surface." It opened automatically at his touch and closed behind him. A narrow hall lined with machinery ended with a second door. Proteus gulped. If he was right, he should be in one of the infrequently used automatic-powered sky elevators on the underside of the floating city, with nothing between him and the Earth but 7 miles of empty space. He looked around at the small globular room in which he stood. He'd made it. The dials on the wall console told him he was in a sky elevator. But suppose he couldn't run it? Suddenly a whirling noise began, an odd droning. Proteus held his breath. His entrance must have activated the mechanism. Even now his weight and dimensions were probably being fed into the microcomputers in charge of descent. A red light flashed on. At the same time, 3 signs glowed to life. Automatic drop, pause for instructions, and hold and wait. The room itself began to vibrate softly. Proteus gulped again, pressed the button marked automatic drop, and closed his eyes as tightly as he could. His stomach lurched. His head snapped back. The sky elevator dropped out of its nest beneath the city and began its descent. Proteus' eyes flew open. Inside, the lights dimmed. A dial flashed. 35,000 feet. The sight of it almost made him sick as he realized that plans were one thing and their realization was something quite different. Here he was, 35,000 feet up in space alone, falling steadily away from the only world he knew. One side of the sky elevator was a transparent window. He looked out, hardly believing what he saw. Bright emptiness stretched all around him, an endless blue sky through which he was descending. Then he looked down in terror, for below there were mountains of black-gray clouds, heavy and threatening, like an ever-moving, uneven floor upon which the sky elevator must surely crash. Despairingly he looked up, to see the dark undersides of the city disappearing as he plunged further down. Could he make the sky elevator reverse itself in mid-air? He eyed the dials. No, he thought. Even with the little he knew, he was sure that reversal was impossible. Now the dial read 30,000 feet. He looked down again, astonished, for as he approached the clouds, holes appeared in them as if by magic. He'd never seen clouds before, not natural ones, only the 3 tamed ones that went past with each 15-minute rain. But he knew about them academically. No film or account could begin to describe what they were really like, though, and involuntarily he shouted out with wonder as the sky elevator dropped through one of the cloud holes. He gasped. The clouds gave way, as if on purpose. The clouds knew. They're alive, he thought, like sky creatures. It seemed to him that they were rushing from all over the open sky to watch. Proteus stood, hands pressed against the window, transfixed. There were layers and layers of clouds. Again he thought of sky creatures gazing. What did they think as they watched him plunged past? Question. Then, suddenly, they thinned out, moved away, rushed away as if frightened. Once more he cried out involuntarily as the curve of the earth appeared, with the sun at one rim, splashing the most incredible rays of light that he'd ever seen or imagined. He'd seen microfilms of sunsets, but they never even hinted at this shimmering vitality. He eyed the dial quickly and looked out again, fascinated. 20,000 feet. The ground, the surface of Earth, suddenly emerged. Giant patches of color were visible, some dark, almost blue-black. Real shadows cast by the real sun, some so brilliant that he could hardly look at them. His excitement grew as the sky elevator dropped further down. The mountains were like gigantic teeth rising out of an open mouth. He was going to land in a perfectly flat area, the floor of the mouth. He held his breath as the sky elevator fell into the shadows below the horizon, and the ground came rushing up. Motion stopped. The sky elevator landed. The door, impossibly, opened. The light blinked on, waiting for instructions. 2 dials shone, one saying, "Keep on hold," and the other, "Automatic return." Proteus bit his lips. If only he dared to set the control on hold, just in case. How good to know that he could get back if he wanted to. Once the sky elevator was gone, His connections with home were broken. But no, the sky elevator mustn't be missed. His hand trembled, but he pushed the return button, then ran out as fast as he could, afraid that the vehicle might take off while he was still inside. He rushed out onto the small ramp down the steps, and took his first step upon the ground. As he stood there, the sky elevator shuddered and 4 small rockets fired, sending their hungry flames outward. The sky elevator lifted, wobbled slightly, and then slowly and surely began its steady rise. He felt as if he were losing everything. "Goodbye," he shouted. Then, resolutely, he turned away. At first glance, the scene before him was terrifying. Instinctively, Proteus looked up, but no plastic dome covered the real harsh sky. Now that it was all above him, on top of him, not around him, it made him uneasy. The late sunset blazed across the rocky plains that reached into the distance where they were finally ringed by high hills. The sun's brilliance hurt his eyes, but more than this, he was unprepared for the spectacular reaches of open space in which he suddenly felt very small and vulnerable. He shivered. He'd never felt so unprotected in his life. He looked up again, this time in the opposite direction. The globular sky elevator was rising, growing smaller and dearer each minute, looking now like a balloon. Soon he wouldn't be able to see it at all. Proteus watched, thinking of the floating city complex to which it would return. He sighed, realizing how snugly he had been within that plastic bauble. Now he almost yearned for the sky elevator's sheltering walls. Already his skin prickled. The air was wild here, not controlled and even. Surprisingly soft, still it pushed against his face, thrust itself all around him, pushed him, though gently. It felt alive. But then so did the ground, which seemed to be a litter of sand granules and stones and small weeds. He was so surprised to be walking on an uneven surface that once he stopped dead still, almost afraid to go on. He wobbled when he walked. The stones hurt his feet, and he realized that in no time at all his shoes would be a complete loss. The sun fell a few notches in the sky. How many other human beings were on Earth? Suddenly he felt brave, heroic, caught up in a rush of exultation. Once his mother had taken him on a business trip to the moon with her, but the moon was civilized and quite mundane in the domed areas. Earth was different. It was primitive, real. In a strange manner, he felt that he'd come home. His aero skis would save his shoes and feet until he got used to walking on the surface. He inflated them and took off, whizzing just above the rocks and stones. But at once he was in trouble. Too late he realized that the skis had been developed for the comparatively even air currents inside the complexes. It was impossible to glide smoothly in this bumpy, undisciplined air. Trying to navigate, he looked down beneath him. So this was Section 7. The entire Earth's surface was designated by symbols now, though archaeologists and historians could rattle off the old names with ease. Still, he wished he knew the name for his landing place. It seemed sad not to know. He searched his mind, but all he could remember was the name Cyprus, which referred to an island, he thought, not a large body of land. Still, a name was a name, and better than none. His skis wobbled in a sudden eddy of air, but already he could tell that he was beginning to handle himself in the new air currents. He glided almost easily over a good-sized air hill, and yelled down at the land, "I name you Cyprus!" Just then he realized that the sun's rays were disappearing. While he didn't need a sheltered spot to put up his small living nodule, the thought of staying out in the open area frightened him. Hopefully he eyed the hills. If only he could reach them before the night came, the real night, without the city's gentle illumination. He tried not to think of the ancient Earth night as he'd read of it in old records. For the first time he wondered how far the hills were in actual miles from Cyprus. End chapter. Peace, light, and love. Aloha.